Let me know if you can relate to this. You were in a relationship with someone at some point, and you felt like you were doing your absolute most in that relationship. You poured all of your love, all of your energy into it, and in return, you end up feeling drained, depleted, maybe even a little bit lost. And by the time you left that relationship, you didn't even recognize yourself. You didn't even recognize the person who was left behind after being drained. If that's the case, you'll want to listen to this. So, welcome to Christianish. This is the podcast for women who have Bibles but lack boundaries. My name is Keshia. I am a dating coach. I am a hypnotherapist. And I help women learn how to heal from their unhealthy relationship patterns and attract cherished relationships. And I wanted to talk about how being with a weak man can drain your feminine energy. Because there's so much talk about wanting God's best for you, wanting to live the life God has for you, wanting to honor God, and wanting to fulfill your purpose in Him. But you can't have the best. You can't serve these purposes that you're trying to fulfill if you are constantly weakened and drained and you have no energy. Like, you can't constantly go around praying for God to give you blessings, and because of your lack of energy, because you've been abused so much, because you've been taken so advantage of, you don't have the capacity to receive those blessings and those opportunities. So we're going to talk about some of the signs that you're being drained by a weak man, what that looks like, how that's keeping you from embracing your feminine energy, and what you can do about it. Because you should not be walking around feeling like you're constantly carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. So the first way that a weak man drains you of your feminine energy is that he forces you into more of your masculine energy. And I want to be clear here. Both men and women have masculine and feminine energy. So there is absolutely no shame as a woman in using your masculine energy. In fact, you should be using your masculine energy sometimes. It is about balance. So as a mostly feminine woman, you would operate mostly in your feminine energy, and you would have a partner who operates mostly in their masculine energy, because all relationships thrive on polarity. They thrive on this idea of one person leaning more masculine within the relationship and one person leaning more feminine. So when there is a vacuum in the relationship, that balance ends up getting met. Which means that if you are with a man who is weaker and who is not really in tune with his masculine energy, you will start to lead more masculine in order to fill the gap. What this looks like is you're with someone who never lets you rest in your softness. You're with a man who never allows you to feel like he can be your safe place. And you find yourself doing all of the things in the relationship. So you make all the major decisions. You handle all the emotional labor. If there's a financial arrangement, such as if you're married or just living together, you'll find yourself handling, if not all the bills, at least majority. And instead of being a woman who is radiant, who's nurturing, who is able to kind of rest in that feminine presence and playfulness, you're always leading. You're always carrying the burdens. You feel more like a soldier constantly going into battle instead of a woman who's adored and who's cherished. And don't get me wrong, back to this whole idea of us having both masculine and feminine energy, I'm not saying that there are no times in a relationship where you will lead. And I'm not saying that, sometimes you have a partner who is dealing with a health issue and you may have to step up and do a little bit more. But this should not be your day-to-day. You should not be in a relationship that constantly leads to you feeling drained. You should not be in a relationship where you feel like this man is not your partner, he's your child. So that brings me to the second way in which a weak man drains your feminine energy. He makes you feel like you're not safe. Part of being in a healthy relationship in which there's polarity and you're the one who's leaning feminine is that you feel safe with your masculine partner. That means that you feel physically safe, but more importantly, you feel emotionally and mentally safe. You need to be able to trust the person that you're with. You don't need to spend 24/7 being worried about what his next excuse is going to be, what his next move is, or the fact that he has a lack of direction. You should not constantly be on edge. You should not constantly be in survival mode, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for something to go wrong. We talk about resting in your femininity for a reason. And if you are in a relationship where you are never resting, then something's wrong. 1 John 4:18 talks about how perfect love casts out fear. So if you're in a relationship with someone who doesn't give you peace and gives you more fear than anything else, that's not love. The third way in which a weak man drains you of your feminine energy, is that he drains you emotionally. When you are with a man who is weak, he will constantly take all of your emotional energy. He will put all of his insecurities, all of his problems, all of his excuses on you. He will talk about all of his problems, but he will not work on ways to actually fix himself. And if you are in a relationship, you deserve to be with someone who is your partner, not your therapist. You are not an emotional rehab for men. And talking earlier about God wanting his best for you, God's best for you is not you being someone's punching bag. The fourth way in which a weak man drains you of your feminine energy is he takes away your softness. Back to this idea of feeling cherished and feeling loved and feeling safe. The opposite of that is always having to have a harder shell because you are constantly arguing, or you are begging for love, or begging for him to pay attention to you, or you're constantly feeling the need to explain. Maybe if I put it this way, he'll act right. maybe if I put it this way, he'll finally see that he's hurt my feelings and he'll stop doing that. You want to be in a relationship where you feel seen for who you are, where you don't have to constantly explain your soul, and where you feel loved. And instead, when you are in these relationships with men who are weak, you end up feeling like you are a caretaker. Once again, not only are you not an emotional rehab for someone, but you are also not your partner's mama. And what ends up happening when you have to parent your partner all the time is that tenderness and nurturing that they always talk about as part of feminine energy, that starts to fade out of the picture. Because instead, you're constantly hustling and grinding to prove how worthy you are. You need to stop betraying yourself. You need to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that you don't have to fight for somebody else to see how wonderfully made that you are. And the fifth way that a weak man can drain your feminine energy is he starts to make you hate or resent love. You know, I always joke about the fact that in my marriage, I'm not the romantic one, that my husband is a lot more romantic than I am. And that is true. He is more romantic than I am. He is much better at the gestures and stuff than I am. I would argue he's probably a little bit more sentimental than I am. But at the end of the day, I do love love, right? That is why I became a dating coach. Is because I have seen the power of relationships. And of course, my own life and in my own marriage. But, you know, my parents have been married for more than 40 years. My sister, my brother, they've both been married for fairly long amounts of times. I grew up around so many married couples. I have a lot of friends who grew up in two-parent households. So I've seen love and what it looks like when it works well. And I love witnessing that. And I love that feeling. And I want to help other women have that feeling, right? So it is heartbreaking to me when a woman is in a relationship with a man who doesn't treat her well because he's weak. Maybe he doesn't have the capacity to love, which is not an excuse. If you encounter a man like that, you should bless him and move on. His lack of capacity is not your problem. But, you know, she's in this situation and it leads her to becoming resentful of love. And you see this on social media all the time. All of these women who are constantly posting about how men are trash, it's not that all men are trash. It's that they've dealt with trash men. And I'm not trying to blame them for that. Like, I'm not trying to victim blame, because I want to make that clear, because I know how cancel culture is. But at the same time, true love is out there, and it is great, and it is a beautiful thing. And it is hard when you've had a couple of bad experiences. It's hard not to get hardened by that. And if you find yourself in a relationship where you're constantly fighting for love and fighting for peace and from respect, love can be something that you start to regret. Something that you regret giving to other people. And then that can translate from that relationship into your future relationships. Even if you leave that relationship, you go into new ones with walls built up. And it makes it hard to find that cherished love again. And then you end up repeating these cycles of being in relationships with people who don't have the capacity to give you what you need. you really have to keep up the faith and belief that when you find the right man, it's going to be a beautiful connection. And I was going to say an effortless connection. That's not completely true. Because you will always be working on your communication skills. You'll always be working on setting and enforcing boundaries. So, like, that never stops, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like work. You won't have to work to be respected. The respect will just be given. The love and the adoration will be given. And it becomes a matter of teaching them in particular how you like to be loved. So, for example, my husband is a generous man and he's a loving man, and he loves to give me flowers. So I've never had to beg him for gifts in general. I've never had to beg him for flowers in particular. But, one thing I had to teach him was the fact that I don't really like roses. Never been a huge fan of roses. There are plenty of other flowers. There's a long list of flowers, I would say, that I prefer to roses. So because of that, yeah, that was one thing that I had to teach him, was like, hey, I don't really like roses like that. Please buy me other flowers. But the generosity in giving flowers in general, or just thinking of me and wanting to do nice things for me, that's not something that I had to push for or fight for. So I'm just going to leave you with this thought, that if you feel like you're carrying everything on your own, you're not in a relationship. You're in a responsibility with a child. You should never be in a situation where you're punished for being soft. You should be in a situation where you are cherished and encouraged to be softer, to think less, to have someone take care of you more. And you need to trust that you're worthy of that. And wait. And have faith that God will bring you to someone who is truly worthy of you. Now, of course, if you need help with that, and with setting boundaries, and with honing your discernment so that you don't end up in these situations, I'd love to help you with that. And you can go to the link in the show notes. If you're listening to this on Spotify or YouTube, there's a link in the description somewhere where you can schedule a call with me and we can work together. And if you're listening on YouTube, there should be a link in the description someplace. But yeah, we can work on how to hone that discernment, how to set those boundaries so that you don't settle for less. But whether you work with me or not, just know that love should always come from a place of peace and never from a place of burden.
This podcast is brought to you by Contessa Digital.